So I wanted to start lightly. This is his first time in Brazil, and he's impressed. So Rudy, thank you so much for coming here. One of the first times we had a chance to speak, I mentioned that we are seeing in Brazil right now what he did in the U.S., and it's so interesting to see the company he had built 20 years ago, and what he's doing right now with kind of the same vision in terms of entrepreneurship, not putting a pilot in the passenger seat, what you always say. And it's a pleasure to have you here. What have you seen from Brazil already that you liked?
Well, it's thanks for having me. And I have to say, Sao Paulo is a really cool city. Excellent food. Met some really interesting people here. So unfortunately, I don't speak Portuguese, but everybody seems to be able to speak English. So yeah, thanks for having me here. And I'm going to Patagonia from here. So it was a natural step along the way to Patagonia.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to start with the original thesis. We're going to have a little bit similar to what we had in the previous panel. We're going to have a few blocks of content, 2 or 3 questions, a space for you guys to make questions, and then we'll vote from there before having a raffle of 2 VIP tickets to the RA Edge afterwards, and then go into the deck where we're going to have a round table of a few discussions with Rudy, okay? So Rudy, when you looked at the RA market in the US in 2004, what kind of inefficiency or injustice bothered you the most? How could you clearly see that and turn that into a company?
Well, so I always like to say I came from the dark side. Yeah, I used to run global brokerage for American Express, which was about 10,000 advisors across the country. And I was always impressed by the fiduciary model, which is independent, client-centric advice. And when we first kind of started to look at this industry, it was thousands of small, medium-sized advisors, and they had one major issue, which was ultimately successions. There were not enough young advisors in the industry, and quite frankly, many of these businesses created enormous value. When we started, there were about 1,000 RIAs managing more than $1 billion US. Now the number is more than double that. But it's basically was an industry that needed a succession solution, an industry that needed a different approach towards growth, and an industry that ultimately fundamentally delivered, I believe, and I continue to believe, a better solution to the end client versus us brokers, large brokerage firms out there. But it wasn't known, so we set out to basically create a win-win-win model, a model that really helps the end client, a model that transformed the RIA industry, which it really did, but also a model that creates a very significant shareholder value.
Back to the not putting a pilot in the passenger seat, when did that become an architecture of the business itself, other than just a mantra? How did you solve it, and how was you made this approach happen?
Yeah, so some of it, quite frankly, goes back to my childhood days. I come from a very entrepreneurial family in Austria for generations. And I always loved the small entrepreneurs. Yes, I came from kind of mega corporate America at McKinsey and American Express, but I always felt that there's such a unique ability of small businesses to connect with their customers or with their clients to create a much more personalized solution than we could ever do in the mega world. And it was really the starting point for us. We recognized that unless you can protect what makes these businesses so successful, you will destroy them. And this ultimately led to this concept of never turning an entrepreneur into an employee, which really resonated from day one. It was really what kind of was the insight that made our business very successful. Unfortunately, I trademarked it, So I can't use this phrase anymore. That's why second best was we don't turn pilots into passengers. But same idea, but unfortunately I made the mistake of trademarking it very early on.
Okay. So we're going to use never turn a successful entrepreneur into an employee. Okay. We have nowadays at least 3 or 4 businesses trying to go B2B as you did in US 20 years ago. We're just a little bit behind. So if you could give a piece of advice for them, what did you say, knowing what you passed in the early days of your focus trajectory?
Well, the kind of the first and most important concept is always what's in for the client, what's in for the customer. And we fortunately, from the start, had a very good theme that really resonated in the marketplace. And it was all about continuity of advice, quality of advice, independence of advice, and ultimately scaling this fiduciary model that I understand is emerging in the Brazilian market still. Scaling it in ways that just has never been done before. When we started, $1 billion RA was a huge firm. When I sold the business, we managed $400 billion and just created a business that just operated on a scale that this industry had never seen before. So you got to start with a very strong client proposition. Second, you need an economic model that works. We spend a lot of time, and quite frankly, I had a lot of help from, actually Goldman Sachs helped me a lot building the business day one. I had a whole team there, and I was still sitting on my kitchen table that helped us with a lot of the work. My friends from McKinsey were very helpful. So we did a lot of work to get the economic model right. And quite frankly, an economic model that today probably wouldn't work anymore. Ultimately, we were, the fundamental economics was based on multiple arbitrage. Fundamentally, we deployed our capital at 5 times, 6 times EBITDA. I sold the business at 14 times EBITDA. It needed leverage. Without leverage, we wouldn't have created this 45x return that we ultimately created. There had to be tax arbitrage, so we had to structure our deals in certain ways that basically created very pure cash flows that we generate. And these 3 factors in an industry that structurally grew somewhere in the mid-single digits organically, and then you add market returns, in average and over time markets go up. So we had kind of tailwinds in the industry that were easily 10, 12, 14%. So you put these things together, you create actually an economic model that is scalable, very profitable, and most importantly, so we started a business in 2006. It was a model that could survive market cycles. We entered 2008. I think we managed about $26 billion at that point. And fortunately, we had a financial structure that really, 2008 barely dented our economics because we had this growth behind us, and we had the capital base to survive the market. And in so many ways, having a strong economic model didn't just help us survive 2008, but there started to be some smaller players that tried to mimic our model, and basically they were all wiped out. And then 2009, 10, 11 was really when we had the whole industry for our own, and we had the capital to basically really accelerate our growth.
Great, and with that, I guess we get to the M&A machine, right? Mm-hmm. So when you figured out the economics, what would work, what wouldn't. So how does Playbook evolved from this first deal, series of deals, and knowing it would work, to a repeatable thing like doing dozens of transactions, and what took you the most time to figure out in that?
So really the M&A concept, yeah, in the US RIA industry didn't exist before we entered. Yeah, so it was at times very humbling experience. Yeah, lots of meetings you go to and nothing ever happens. And so we really had to build the machine, yeah, in a way that it was scalable. And first thing we had to do is find a way to describe our business model. Yeah, that's really, really, really hard when you're the only ones who is doing it, and really to articulate the proposition to the RIA community. It probably took us 3 months just to learn how to talk about the opportunity that we are presenting. And then, yeah, we had to start to create a certain level of pattern recognition that basically allowed us to use our time efficiently. We started on my kitchen table. Yeah, it was my 2 co-founders and I, and that was it. Yeah, and a couple of other people, but yeah, we were really at the forefront. So the most precious resource was our use of time. And here to start to recognize here what are the targets that are worth our while, and what are the targets that are unlikely to ever be required a lot of trial and error and a lot of self-reflection on how to build it. After the first, maybe the first deal is always the hardest, yeah. And my agreement with Summit Partners, who was the financial partner behind, it was basically my family's money and Summit Partners who invested in this originally. Yeah, we started with 17.5 million in equity. We sold the business for 7.3 billion. So there was a lot of steps in between to connect these dots, but. Finding the kind of an efficient approach to ultimately build the machine required target recognition, the theme that you can tell to the targets, and then an ability to start building the M&A team. When we sold the business, we had the largest M&A team in the industry. We had probably 35, 40 people who were just out there doing, in a typical year, we would do 15 to 20 transactions, and it had to be standardized. Many of the deals were small. Well, small by US standards, maybe $1, $2, $3 billion firm. And if every deal you negotiate individually, and you'll never get, you'll never be able to build a large business. It had to have a very standardized approach from a financial perspective, from a legal perspective, from a post-merger integration perspective. And all of this, obviously took some time to develop. Actually, maybe one more thing is, my 2 co-founders and I, we always knew one thing. We are not going to build a small business. And so that basically meant is, we always knew that this is, well, we kind of invented this industry in some ways, but this thing will be 50 billion, will be 100 billion. We never knew it's going to be 400 billion when we sold. But when you think about building a large business, you approach it differently. You use the best lawyers, you use the best bankers, you use very scalable sources of capital. You build a network of banks to kind of grow and develop the leverage capacity. So it's a certain level of kind of professionalism that, even sitting on my kitchen table, that we had from day one that ultimately allowed us to build a pretty large business.
And in terms of M&A also, I guess you got used to see a lot of businesses and also partners that you would be willing to acquire or not and put into, let's say, the focus ecosystem. And what truly separated a good partner firm from a not so good partner firm? And did that change, that answer changed over time with maturity of focus or not?
Yeah, first and foremost, you needed partners who dreamed the dream. From day one, we only bought 50% of the economics of the business. So our partners retained the other 50%. So ultimately, to join us, Yeah, and we built Focus basically doing 300 M&A deals over almost 20 years. They really needed to not just believe that we pay them a fair price for the half that we are buying, but they really need to believe that the other half is going to grow faster in partnership with us than standalone. So we had to demonstrate and really ultimately learn how to add value to these firms. Now they also needed to believe that as their businesses double, triple over time, there's also liquidity on the other 50% that we didn't buy. So we had to have a succession solution that really ultimately gave them the kind of the perspective of, this is a sequence of transactions, not just one transaction at the very beginning. Quite frankly, we wouldn't be able to have the capital to buy 100% across billions and billions of transactions, or it would have been very expensive for us. So by being able to really slice the deals into one step at a time, we really, in many ways, we built a proprietary M&A pipeline that was embedded in our business model. And quite frankly, the current owners, they are very much harvesting this proprietary pipeline that we built. So, what made a good partner? What made a difficult partner? Really, the sharing of the vision, sharing of the really we are building this together versus I'm selling and then maybe I'm still there but I'm no longer growing and believing. So it had to be the growth orientation. Two, and this is where we made mistakes over the years, the partner dynamics. The most challenging deals were the ones where we misread the dynamics among the leadership. Was it really a coherent group of senior leaders? Was there a next generation of leaders in the organization? Or were there really very divergent kind of approaches? And very often when there was trouble within the partners, we had, when we sold, we had 6,000 employees, we had about 700 partners. Whenever you got 700 people doing things, there's always some trouble somewhere. And we had to spend a lot of time, and de facto it cost us quite some money to deal with this intra-partner relationships. So coherency of partners, next generation, one disappointment we had was next generation not really wanting to step into the shoes of the original founding generation. So one thing I learned early on into our journey is the best way to get to know these partners is to get to know their families. So most deals, my wife showed up, one of my kids showed up, my dog showed up, whatever, and because that was the best way to get to know their families. And some of the least successful deals that we did, quite frankly, I do remember lively that my wife was telling me, what, you're going to do a deal with these guys? I would never do a deal with these guys. And then when it blew up, she said, oh, I told you so. So really, ultimately, these are very personal businesses. These are not clients. These are really friends in so many ways of these firms. So really understanding who they are and what's kind of the depth and quality of these relationships with their clients is really, really difficult. And we did pretty well, but certainly we didn't have a perfect track record.
Okay, and that was your most expensive mistake, both at home and at work?
It was very often partner dynamics. That's when it cost us money usually. It was almost never that our partner firms didn't grow. There was just so much momentum in this industry. I mean, and I'm sure that's true in many of the countries. So it was true in most of the countries where we operated. We operated in 10 different countries. Unfortunately, I never made it to Brazil, but you almost have to be an artist not to grow in this industry. Yeah, growth is natural and it's coming. But then, when they start fighting with each other and disagreements and the next generation wants to leave and whatever, that's where things can get very, very tricky.
Okay, which brings us to IPO, right? So in 2018, you led Focus to its IPO in NASDAQ. What finally convinced you to do that move, and what have you figured was the most difficult part of being a public CEO?
Yeah, that's probably the one thing I don't want to do again, running a US public company. I did it for 5 years. But the rationale was we started to reach a scale where we really wanted to internationalize the business. And we had a traditional private equity complex structure before we IPO'd the business. And when I went to Australia, to Switzerland, or many of the markets, UK, it was a difficult structure to sell, difficult structure to communicate outside of the US, because it was very much of a traditional US private equity model. So by basically taking the business public, first, you don't have to explain much about your financials anymore. You publish them every quarter and you explain them to the investment community every quarter. It's a much cleaner structure. There's no preferred equity and different slices of in the equity stack. And so it was a much easier model to explain. It was immediate branding. We were the first business to go public in this space, and still till today, there's nobody else who took the step to public. It was pure mass. Weighted average cost of capital went down substantially because of the structure. We could use the public currency as consideration, which made things so much easier, because it had usually after 6 months lockup, it had immediate liquidity. But really, first and foremost, it was a big step towards internationalizing the business, which really, when you just empirically look at it, our US was a very steady growth trajectory. Focus basically was compounding at 30% a year for 20 years. But it really opened up the international markets to us.
Then, before heading to a round of questions, if you guys have it, I'm going to talk a little bit, closing Focus Partner chapter, legacy and reflection. So which beliefs you had while opening up in 2004 Focus about the RIA model, which things proved absolutely right, and which turned out to be wrong about this market?
Oh, nothing was ever wrong. Well, clearly, at the core, we were a bet on kind of ongoing wealth generation in America, and first and foremost in the US. And ultimately, when you look at net worth in America, it grew very much in the way we expected, and quite frankly, even better than we expected. And so some of the international markets, like the UK, was a good example. If you are in an economy where there's not much wealth generation, it's hard to be in the wealth management business. So some of the markets, quite frankly, were less attractive with the benefit of hindsight. The UK is not an easy market to make money, and whatever money you make here, the tax man takes away. So it's ultimately UK was probably the least successful of the markets that we operated in on wealth generation in key markets. To the fiduciary model, to this day, basically the fiduciary part of our industry in the US and in international markets is growing at basically double the rate of what the traditional brokerage models have. And some of this growth, certainly in the early days, about half of this growth was from clients ultimately leaving the traditional brokerage world and voting with their feet and getting a fiduciary advisor. And the other half of the growth was basically brokers and bankers, usually higher-end brokers or high-end brokers and bankers, basically leaving the traditional brokerage houses and banks and becoming RIAs. So this clearly worked out way really beyond our expectations. One area which was very helpful when we built the business and was an important part of our initial thesis was when we started in 2006, there was really still a technological disadvantage of being a small RIA versus being at Merrill Lynch or at Morgan Stanley or many of the big shops. By the way, in my McKinsey days, I actually built Merrill's trusted global advisor platform. It was $1 billion those days. This was still a lot of money, a technology project. But what we saw in 2006 was that there was this rich ecosystem of small, medium-sized technology companies emerging that ultimately created a parity, where what we could put on the desktop of our advisors, quite frankly, was superior to what the wirehouses could do. And this ecosystem got better and better. And I know we'll be talking, of course, about AI, because you can't do a panel without talking about AI. I think actually this advantage is accelerating further today. So our bet on the technology support that we could really give these advisors was excellent. Areas that where we maybe weren't wrong, but were kind of, one was the some of the international markets that ultimately we bet on didn't turn out the way I wanted to, although if kind of we had more time, maybe the evolution would have been supportive. We probably didn't, certainly initially, focus enough on kind of integration. For if you're ever bored and you look at some of my quarterly earnings calls, a key question I got every single quarter was, so what's your AUM? And what is organic? What's M&A? And for 5 years, I never really had a good answer to that, because we didn't have the systems to really track the flows in the way that we should have. That was probably my single biggest regret, that when we took it public, we should have had this infrastructure, but we didn't. And I know that the new team is building this infrastructure and pretty much has it now. We probably, so I'm on the board of one of the leading AI companies here, supporting really the financial planning world in the US. It's called Luminary AI. Actually, we have a board meeting tomorrow. I wish we had invested more in the financial planning side, more of the support capabilities. In fact, some of the things that were discussed on the prior panel, the type of capabilities that we now have with Luminary is a total game changer in the industry. But it really takes what is a very manual, very human supported process and really automates it to a great degree, but also makes it much more intuitive for the client. So this is an area where probably we could have invested some more. But 2020 hindsight is always easy, but when you build a business that creates a 45x financial return, can you build a 100x financial return? I'm sure you could, but we were okay.
I'm even surprised you have regrets, because there was a big, let's say, legacy that Focus gave to our industry. And to close this chapter, what do you think, in one paragraph, that would be the legacy that Focus has built for the global management, wealth management history?
Well, I really think it goes back to kind of the core belief system that we had. And we really put the fiduciary model on the map. We took an industry that obviously existed before us. The fiduciary model goes back to the Advisors Act of 1940. But it was a total backwater. It was an industry that created a lot of value for individual clients, but it wasn't known as a real alternative to the Merrills and the Morgan Stanleys, the big brokerage houses. And we really changed that. Now the fiduciary model is widely recognized as the leading wealth management model in the US, and I think we can take a little bit of credit for that. And then the second thing I really think we can take some real credit for is we ultimately demonstrated to these small, medium-sized businesses that they're actually creating enormous equity value. We really ultimately, when we, the typical transition model before Focus entered the market was, you build up a business, obviously created very attractive personal cash flows, but ultimately upon retirement, you just hand it over to the next generation de facto for nothing. And you really didn't build much equity value. We ultimately demonstrated that these businesses created tens and tens of millions of dollars of equity value for a successful partner that ultimately had a real path to liquidity, but a path to liquidity that didn't ultimately require them giving up their core belief system in the fiduciary model, but they could really ultimately continue with one of our big propositions to the end client was continuity of advice. So you can build a great business, you can generate great cash flows and adding a lot of value to the client, but upon retirement, you can look your clients in the eye and basically say, you will be taken care of as well as before by the next generation. But at the same time, you can create enormous value for the principals and for their families.
Perfect, thank you. I guess we are taking advantage in Brazil of what you have built in this fiduciary duty and this maturity of the market as a whole. So big thanks. Now, before moving to the next chapter, I can allow one or two questions because you're not, okay. Quick one, two, okay, taken. I'm gonna hand the microphone for you. If you prefer to talk in Portuguese, I can translate.
Oh, no worries. First of all, thank you, Mr. Rudiger, for the 30-minute MBA. My name is Bruno. I'm a co-founder of InvestSmart, and we consider ourselves the Brazilian version of Focus. We have 107 offices, and I wanna ask you about the financial model, the M&A, basically the earnings before partners compensation model. Mm-hmm. How did you keep your new partners from slowing down? Because we are struggling with that.
Yeah. That's always a very, very important question. One is, I'm sure you've read if you haven't, you should, the Harvard Business School case on us, which really explains the economic model. So first is, don't buy too much up front. So basically by having this sequence of transactions, you're really aligning long-term interest between the partners who are coming in and you as the current and future owner. All of our deals had an earnout. So again, not upfront cash, but these earnouts were very attractive because if you continue to grow, basically you can double your consideration easily. So they were very motivating. And then we made sure that the earnouts, a good component of the earnouts also went to the next generation. So not just to the founding generation. So the initial consideration usually went to the founders. There was usually very little that went to the next generation, but we could vector more of the earnouts to the next, so that really empowered and incentivized the whole organization. Three is we used our own equity. So everybody was a shareholder in focus, yeah, and that created a lot of alignment and really excitement. Yeah, so we had deals where maybe the upfront multiple, particularly in the early deals, was 6x or 7x of this EBPC, so the free cash flow. The effective multiple these partners sold for was probably 40x. Yeah, and the rest came earnouts, yeah, the performance of our own stock. Yeah, many of them got our shares at $5, $6, $10 a share, and yeah, economically we sold it over $60 a share. So if you apply this, so it all comes down to having the right incentive model that creates alignment. Now, these things were pretty easy to do. Well, nothing is ever easy, but quite easy to do when you were the only game in town. Yeah, because we invented this industry really. So there was no competition, so we could really fine-tune the model, yeah, in the right way, and then we could scale fast enough that when the next generation of players came in, basically we were already the market leader and we were the kind of the place to beat. Could we create this economic model today? No, not anymore. Yeah, the multiples in our industry have just turned insane. Yeah, there are deals now in the US where upfront multiple is 20x, 25x. So if you do the math and you buy a business for 25x, you have a 5-year hold period. Yeah, what it basically means is you're betting that this business will compound at 50% a year for the next 5 years. Yeah, so you can get a 20% return on equity. That's impossible. So, yeah, 3 years ago I concluded, or 2 years ago, yeah, it's better to be a seller than a buyer, yeah, in the US right now. It's an overbought market. Yeah, there are 60 private equity firms, yeah, that are now operating in the US RA industry. It's really hard to make money when you have this type of dynamics. So yeah, I prefer to sell than to buy in the US. Yeah, obviously I don't know about Brazil.
Great, and I guess we have someone from BlackRock here, so yeah, they know about it. They were lead advisors. Next question before next chapter.
Rudy, first of all, thanks for being here. My name is Bruno. I'm the co-founder of Clube do Valor. It's like a RIA firm here in Brazil. And you just talked about technology, and I would like to go deeper on this. And what were the specific levers that most consistently helped partner firms accelerate their growth, and which of those were hardest to replicate before joining your platform or focus?
Yeah. So my answer today would be different. And yeah, when we talk about AI, it has a lot to do with the way how AI is changing our industry. For us, it was first and foremost kind of getting the basics right. You know, these were very successful firms, so we wouldn't have bought them. You know, unless a firm in our world, which was a big reason for the economics that I described before, is grew at like in average and over time at least 10% a year. Yeah, we would have never invested in them. Yeah, that's kind of was the minimum criteria, growth criteria. But this growth really ultimately came from having terrific clients and serving them well. It had very little to do with running the back office professionally, having the reporting tools, having the statements to the partners. So a lot of what we did was helping them get to an industry standard in terms of all the back office systems, all the back office capabilities. There were lots of kind of getting the basic right things that were critical. Organizational changes, yeah. Do they have enough incentives around growth? Yeah. So very often we change the incentive systems in these businesses, because when you got an industry where you just got these tailwinds of markets and just clients getting richer, yeah, we had a way where we could predict the profitability of our acquisitions for the next 3+ years just by analyzing their client base and their existing share of wallets. Yeah, we had a very good predictive model that kind of allowed us to basically say, hey, these guys don't have to get a single client and they are going to grow at X, because these options will mature, these businesses will be sold, and this is then liquidity that they retained, which, by the way, a little bit back to the panel we had before, the financial planning component is absolutely essential. A business that just, in our world, that just sells investment products or manages investment products, we would never buy. The financial planning angle was absolutely essential, because that's where you get to know the client. That's where you know what they are doing. So one regret, actually, it's maybe helpful to you. One regret I have is we should, and we're doing this in our new businesses now, having one central CRM system would have been a game changer for us. Ultimately, we kept our CRM systems for those firms that had CRM systems, not everybody did, but we kept them decentralized. That was a mistake. If day one we would have said mandatory, every firm that joins is going to go onto Salesforce. Actually, we had an overlay system on top of Salesforce. Salesforce was too complex. It had to get customized. But we have business we discovered in Australia, and then we brought to the US, and they're now one of the largest in the US. So we helped them get their CRM systems in and create the procedures around it, but we didn't centralize it. That was a mistake. This I would definitely do differently now, and I'm doing differently now. So we were still in a world by, actually maybe I should mention one more thing. In the moment a firm joined us, by being part of Focus, it gave them enormous purchasing power, because we were de facto the largest customer of just about any vendor in the US. Once you manage 50, 100 billion, and the next largest is 10 billion, you just are a totally different entity, which basically means you get preferred placement in referral programs from the custodians. Very important lever. You get better pricing on many of the services. We centralized, or to a good degree, by being the largest client of just about every player in the industry, we had one group of relationship managers. So if there was a problem with Fidelity, I was Fidelity's largest client, we had one group that our partners could call that immediately had a very different level of attention. We were Schwab's largest client, same thing. You had one central customer service team. So that de facto gave our partner firms an immediate upgrade in terms of better pricing and better service by joining our organization.
Okay, thank you. Now moving to the next chapter. Most people would have retired after a 7.3 billion exit, right? Instead, you launched E3 Tech with A16Z, right? What is a continuation of the Focus history, and what is completely new in this new endeavor?
Obviously we were pretty well known on Wall Street, and when we sold, I got lots of calls from just about any private equity group, but all the calls were all the same. They said, "Oh, Rudy, now that you're available, why don't you just do another Focus? And by the way, would you mind making it 100x, not a 50x?" That wasn't interesting. And quite frankly, I simply believe the model that made us so successful does no longer work in the US industry. You need to have a different model. But there was one call I got from Andreessen Horowitz, which was totally different. And it was basically, yeah, I'm sure you guys know Andreessen. It's the number one MVC group basically in the world. And yeah, they are in all the hot AI investments that you could imagine. But they basically had a thesis that they wanted to prove, which is by one way to create very attractive investments is by going into traditional industries, really lagging industries from a technology adoption perspective, and then transform them through the power of AI. And if the story had stopped here, there was no need to call me, because I'm not an AI guru. Although I'm more and more talking about AI, maybe I'm emerging into an AI guru, but I'm not. But because of the kind of the trajectory when you implement AI in traditional industries, yeah, it takes lead times. Yeah, the economics are not immediate. It takes some time. So they realized that if you combine AI with a traditional roll-up model, yeah, you're actually getting you have the best of both worlds. Yeah, you have this really compelling roll-up economics. Yeah, so you need to be a serial acquirer. That's kind of what I brought to the party. And you combine this with AI, you have actually a pretty unique model. Yeah, and I firmly believe what we are doing is unique in the States. And my wife is still coming to the conclusion that she's married to a plumber now. Yeah, we are one of the largest MEPs in America, and so that's mechanical, electrical, and plumbing. By the way, I'm a really good plumber, just if you need your bathrooms fixed or whatever, call me. So basically the first industry that we went into is industrial construction. Yeah, and we bought this business 12 months ago. We quadrupled it in less than 12 months in terms of, actually we tripled it. We quintupled it by the end of this year. And we purposely took an industry that in so many ways hasn't really transformed the way it operates since the time of the pyramids. My old alma mater, McKinsey, has this chart where they are showing productivity gains by industry. Actually, usually it's on a logarithmic scale, so meaning really every industry has done amazing. And then you got construction, which is just doing absolutely nothing from a productivity improvement. So we thought it was a very obvious area to get started. And I have to say, we have found the mother lode of process improvement opportunities, and it's a really cool industry. It's good to be a plumber these days, particularly when you're an AI-enabled plumber. And our group is involved in many of the most complex data center projects. Here we have battery plants. We built the largest and the third largest in the world, very complex automobile. So totally different industry, but what's the same? It's still a bet on entrepreneurship. We keep a very decentralized business model. It's very much a bet on your fundamental process improvement, and it's a major bet on AI that basically we are placing here.
And to talk about AI, so you built Focus before generative AI even existed, and now you're betting heavily on it. Do you still believe, I guess this dates back to a CNBC interview you gave around IPO time, so that computers won't replace financial advisors. Do you still believe that, and how does that change with AI nowadays?
Yeah, I think there was the interview I did just after the IPO, at the New York Stock on NASDAQ. So, look, if anybody tells you they know exactly what AI is going to do, they are fools, because nobody really knows. The power of AI is basically doubling every 6 months. Yeah, none of us. Yeah, I know. Yeah, if you ever invite me back, 3 or 5 years from now, it's going to be totally different. Yeah, and in a critical way, there are many human functions simply are going to get replaced. Yeah, that's just going to happen. Having said that, other human functions are going to get tremendously enhanced in value. And it was a little bit discussed on the panel before. Why ultimately, yeah, and even what I'm doing now, we look at AI as an enhancement of human capabilities. Yeah, we are not looking at it as a replacement, although it will do some replacement, obviously, no question. Yeah, you don't want to be a coder right now. Yeah, 80% of all code is now written by AI, and it's better than the coder. So there's a replacement, but what it is unlikely to replace, yeah, certainly not for many, many years, is the human interaction. And what I love about the wealth management industry, what I love about what you're all doing, and I'm still doing in other areas, but is we are the ultimate peace of mind industry. Yeah, what creates the magic of the RIA fiduciary model is the peace of mind model. Yeah, we, as part of our due diligence process, yeah, maybe helpful to you again, is we always interview clients. Yeah, so we had a database of thousands of client interviews. Yeah, no deal ever gets closed without client interviews. So we learned a huge amount of what do they value. Yeah, why do they hire this particular advisor? What don't they value? Yeah, good example is, I always thought, yeah, before we started the focus journey, performance kind of matters. You know, people hire a professional advisor because they need to have a certain level of performance. Yeah, having done, my team and I, thousands of client interviews, when we ask them, why do you choose advisor X, the concept of performance either doesn't get mentioned at all, or it's maybe factor number 3, 4, or 5 on the list. Yeah, and then we had immediate follow-up questions. So, okay, so performance is the 4th most important thing for you. So how did they perform? Yeah, so how do you think about it? Never, and these are, many of these are customers with hundreds of millions of net worth. Yeah, we were mainly US, we were very much geared towards high net worth and ultra high net worth families. And never, not a single time did they get the performances. Yeah, they outperformed the S&P or this blended mix by 250 basis points with whatever Sharpe ratio of X and Y and Z. And these were really sophisticated families. Yeah. But kind of the most sophisticated answers we usually got was, well, in 08 we did pretty well. Yeah, we didn't really go that much down or whatever. So back to your question. Number 1, 2, and 3, one way or the other was always one concept, and that is I trust them. I trust them with the way they take care of my money. I'm a busy executive, I'm a busy entrepreneur. I just don't want to deal with my investments because it's not what I'm interested in. So I need somebody I can trust to take care of that. And the way they have managed their money, not performance, but just from an overall perspective, really gives me the level of comfort that I can do the things I want to do, and don't have to focus on managing my money. Number 2 or 3, whatever, every single time was, and if something happens to me, I know my family will be okay. Yeah, my wife will be okay, my kids will be okay. My charitable foundations, obviously we had a lot to do with setting up foundations and managing foundations, the endowment of the foundations. So this peace of mind, and then in the complexity of often multi-generational families, that's hard to replicate. Until there was a little bit of discussion on the prior panel. You go to the doctor, but you ask your AI system before. What is the doctor going to tell you? Today, in X-ray or in MRI, the AI is simply better than a radiologist reading these results. In fact, there are studies where basically when you have the AI read the system and then you get a human involved, the performance drops. So literally the radiologist decreases the level of performance. But you got lung cancer, you still want a human being to basically look at it, and hopefully he uses AI, so that's the AI augmentation of the human. But what ultimately managing the wealth of a high net worth, ultra high net worth family is really somewhere on the level of brain surgery. This is really, really complex. It's not managing how you beat the S&P or you don't beat the S&P. That's commoditized. But the way you deal with the family dynamics, the way you set up the estate plans, that's the Luminary AI system that I mentioned before, that's really hard. And like one of the biggest values I'm getting from my financial advisor is they actually once they talk to the kids, and they can be much tougher on the kids than dad and mom can ever be. So I think this part, the AI is going to be the human augmentation. I don't see the replacement, certainly on the ultra high net worth and on the high net worth side.
Okay, thank you. Now, moving to close, we're about to close with this part of the panel because marketing girls are looking at me and I know I'm short on time. So, Rudy, if you could leave one piece of advice for the next generation of advisors in Brazil and these entrepreneurs, what it would be?
Well, obviously, it would be presumptuous for me to say anything about the Brazilian market, but hey, you're living in a cool city, this I can say. And the more I'm reading about Brazil, it's actually a pretty cool country. I had no idea that actually, I just learned that when I flew down here, is you take out Alaska, so you just look at the contiguous US. Brazil is actually bigger than America, than the US. I had no idea. That's fascinating. And Sao Paulo is certainly way bigger than New York. Actually seems to be also a more fun place these days, but I digress. So nothing about Brazil, but look, looking around the room, I think the most exciting thing is your single biggest advantage is you're all really young. And if I sit in a similar meeting in Europe, oh boy, sometimes they're willing in the wheelchairs, and still even in the US. So this is a huge advantage because it really changes your investment horizon, your personal, your career and investment horizon in so many ways. And in an industry that's as dynamic as it is, that's a huge advantage. And by the way, for the record, I'm also still very young, but maybe not quite as young as you guys. But so one is whatever is going to happen, if you can, on balance, make 2 percentage, 3 percentage point better decisions every year, the compounding effect in an industry that's as dynamic as this is just fantastic. So I think that's two is the single biggest value as we evolved with the focused business model where the client interviews. Having this thousands and thousands of interviews, deep interviews with some of the wealthiest families in America, and the way they are thinking was just, this was our true north. This guided our journey in so many ways, because every business has really ultimately one criterion, that is, what are you doing for the customer? What are you doing for the client? So truly understanding Yeah, and that's different market by market. Yeah, the interviews we did in the UK were very different to the interviews we did in Switzerland or in Australia or yeah, certainly in the States. So really understanding the customer and how their lives are changing, how their businesses are changing, and therefore what their needs are, and really multi-generational. Yeah, so much of what our advisors did was not about the matriarch or the patriarch or the first generation. They already had more than enough money. It was all about the next generation, the generation thereafter. Yeah, that's where the big value added was, that and understanding that was absolutely critical. And third is, yeah, there isn't a panel or a meeting or I'm sure I'm going down to, as I said before, to Patagonia, and I'm sure, yeah, we'll be talking about AI down in Patagonia too, yeah. But reality is you got to embrace AI. As it was said on the panel before, is you can't ignore it. It's actually, I have a question here, I ask this always. So who in the room is using AI every day? Yeah, that's the right answer. Yeah, it's if you don't, yeah, and as was said on the prior panel, and you need to use it in your personal life. You need to use it in everything that you do, because this is happening. AGI is going to happen. You know, the typical AI today has an IQ of 140. If you believe the doubling of capability every 6 months, we are going to deal with a level of intelligence that humanity has never seen before. We now, and by the way, my new business is a huge beneficiary of it. So really what's happening is we are turning energy into intelligence. Now, that's a totally different concept, like when you think of the Industrial Revolution, it was all about making physical labor more efficient, which is a very small concept, yeah, as big as it obviously was. It created the modern world. But taking energy and creating and turning it into intelligence on a level none of humanity has never seen before, yeah, I mean, it's just going to be the coolest journey that we could imagine. And you got to be part of it. Yeah, you got to embrace it, because it's not going to ask you if you want it or not. It's here, yeah, and it's going to happen. And quite frankly, the biggest reason why I love what I do and why I'm still working and out there doing things is you got to be a player when these things happen right in front of your eyes. And just reading about it is cool, but investing in it is cool. Yeah, it's obviously the next level. But really being part and being able to shape this, and obviously in my case, I'm fortunate to have probably the most sophisticated partners in the world with Andreessen. That's exciting, and that's a journey that I would recommend to everybody. So this was more than one thing, but hope it was helpful.
Thank you so much. And just for you guys to know, Rudy is speaking at RA Edge in Boca Raton in June. But you guys managed to hear him out and what he's up to before US. So that's one for Brazil. And before heading to the deck, when we're going to have a dynamic, I want to give you a gift, because it's such a gift to have you here and giving all these insights for us. So we have a kind of a Mineiro gift. It's the state here from, I dropped something, okay. It's kind of heavy. So this is a small gift. If you can carry it to Patagonia, I can have it in Miami for you next week. But I won't carry it up around Fitzroy. Yeah. And thank you so much. And for you guys, you have two gifts also. They're going to raffle. 2 tickets, VIP with concierge tickets to the RA Edge, which is a partner of ours. And I'm going to ask for your help to raffle the tickets. So let's see. We asked you guys to take your Simpla QR codes to enter the event, because we need your numbers for him to pick a number and for us to see which one of you guys would get this VIP ticket. So we have numbers 1 from 25, and you get to pick 2.
1 to 25?
Yeah.
3 and 50.
Okay, so 3 is Leonardo Rico. Yay, good, right? The ticket to the event itself. We're gonna talk you through details afterwards. So yeah. And the second one was 15. So Bruno Ora. Yeah, good one. Guys, we can take a picture. Like all the three of us. Let's take a picture.
I'll be there for the World Cup, so yeah.
Okay, thank you. A round of applause for Rudy. Please. So now you guys gonna have, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes tops to go to the bathroom, get some refreshments, and then we are heading to the deck. You're gonna see the tables there. Tables have teams. So M&A, organic growth, AI this, AI that. So pick a table that fits the let's say the hurdle that you have that hurts the most your business today. And then we're gonna be walking with Rudy to each one of those tables for you guys to present yourselves and talk about your problems. And then he'll be able to give a single piece of advice for each table, okay? Thank you.